Welcome to the debate. Today, we are analyzing Lee Cronin's interpretation of the mummy through a highly specific and frankly fascinating framework. We are looking at it through internal family systems psychology, or IFS.
Right, which is quite a pivot from the usual monster movie critique.
It really is. In Cronin's reimagining of the classic story, we're presented with a narrative where the monster is not just, some simple ancient evil. Instead, the film treats the mummy as this extreme, exiled trauma response, carrying a millennial legacy burden. We're essentially looking at a psychological landscape.
Yeah. It's a terrifying exploration of a frozen internal system that is violently thawing out in the modern world.
Precisely, and that brings us to the central question we are tackling today. When a horror narrative is fundamentally about family trauma and this frozen internal psychology, should the ultimate resolution be a therapeutic unburdening of the monster?
Or, conversely, does the visceral physiological nature of body horror, which, Cronin relies on heavily, demand a traditional, physically destructive conclusion for the sake of the audience?
Right. And I will argue that treating the mummy as a traumatized exile, requiring empathy, offers a far superior, profound narrative catharsis.
And I will be arguing that the extreme physical violation inherent in body horror demands a definitive, destructive resolution, to satisfy the audience's triggered survival instincts.
Let's get right into it then. I want to lay out my position on why a therapeutic resolution isn't just some artsy alternative, but a necessary evolution for the horror genre. In Cronin's The Mummy, we are forced to reevaluate the very nature of the monster itself.
Okay, lay it out.
Under the internal family systems framework, the human mind isn't just one monolithic thing, right? It's made up of different parts. And in this framework, the mummy is the ultimate exile.
Let's make sure we define that, though, for anyone not steeped in clinical psychology.
Good call, yeah. So in IFS, an exile is a part of your psyche that holds extreme pain, trauma, or shame. To protect the rest of the system from feeling that unbearable pain, other parts of the mind lock the exile away in the basement, so to speak.
Which the film makes incredibly literal.
Exactly. We have a being that was literally buried alive, betrayed by its own family, and stripped of its identity. It is a literal exile. So when it finally wakes up, all the plagues, the chaos, the sheer destruction it causes...
It's massive.
Right, but these aren't the actions of a conscious, malevolent mastermind plotting world domination.
So you're saying it's a firefighter response?
I am. In IFS therapy, firefighters are the parts of the mind that jump into action when an exile is triggered. Their entire job is to numb or distract from the pain at absolutely any cost.
Even if it burns the house down.
Exactly. In real life, a firefighter response might look like someone lashing out in blind rage when they feel embarrassed, or turning to substance abuse to numb out a childhood trauma. The firefighter doesn't care about the collateral damage. It just wants to put out the emotional fire.
Right.
So when the mummy wakes up and unleashes a literal sandstorm, that is a massive, chaotic firefighter response trying to numb the pain of a 1,000-year abandonment. I see why you think that traditional horror requires a violent defeat of the monster, but let me give you a different perspective.
Go on.
Traditional horror protagonists operate as what IFS calls managers. Managers try to control the environment to keep the exiles hidden. They use seals, magical rituals, heavy stone doors to lock the monster away again. It perfectly mirrors how humans repress negative emotions.
Sure, they want to put a lid on it.
But the core truth of the material we are discussing is that you cannot destroy a part of the system. You can only release its burden. Therefore, a narrative ending rooted in therapeutic witnessing and unburdening is the only psychologically resonant resolution.
Well, I come at it from a different way. Your perspective is incredibly elegant on a purely clinical, theoretical level. If we were just reading a script, I might actually agree with you.
But we aren't.
No, we aren't. Your view entirely ignores the physiological reality of the medium we are discussing. Film is a visceral medium, and Cronin's signature use of extreme body horror fundamentally changes the equation here.
How so? The psychology of the monster remains the same regardless of the special effects budget.
The monster's psychology might remain the same, sure, but we cannot separate the psychological framework from the audience's psychology in the theater.
Right.
When an audience sits down to watch a horror film, their internal managers, to use your term, establish a strict safety contract. The contract is basically, hey, this is just a movie. We are safe in these comfortable seats. Extreme body horror actively and aggressively breaches that contract.
But why does body horror breach it more than, say, a traditional ghost story or a psychological thriller?
Because of how our brains map our sense of self. In the IFS model, the body is the literal home of all these psychological parts. Our mirror neurons connect our physical bodies to the bodies we see on screen.
Okay, I follow.
So when you witness a body rotting, mutating, or being forcefully reconstructed like we see with the mummy, the brain registers it as a severe boundary violation. It triggers profound existential dread.
Right, it's uncomfortable.
It's more than uncomfortable. It attacks the survival instinct on a biological level because it threatens the integrity of the container, the body. A therapeutic conversation at the climax of the film is woefully insufficient to process that level of somatic terror.
I mean, I wouldn't call it a simple conversation.
The audience requires an explosive physical defeat of the monster to release the extreme adrenaline built up by their own internal firefighters. You cannot just talk down a physiological panic attack. You have to break the tension physically.
I understand the intensity of the physiological reaction, but let's look at the nature of that tension, and specifically the nature of the monster's destruction. Think about what the mummy is actually doing when it unleashes that sandstorm or when the plagues start.
It's destroying everything in its path.
Yes, but it is acting out of a legacy burden. In IFS, a legacy burden is an extreme belief or emotion handed down through generations, like shame, rage, or in this case, a thirst for revenge. Asking the monster, "What are you in pain about?" that you must create a sandstorm, addresses the actual root cause of the chaos.
But is it realistic for a protagonist to pause and ask a decaying lethal entity about its feelings while it's summoning a plague? Seriously?
It's not about sitting it down on a leather couch in a tomb. Let me offer an analogy to explain how this looks in practice. Treating the mummy purely as a physical threat is like treating a radioactive leak by acting like a rigid, panicked manager.
Okay.
The protagonists are scrambling to build a lead sarcophagus around the reactor. They want to contain the damage, slap a biohazard sign on it, and just walk away. But IFS suggests we need to neutralize the emotional isotope itself.
Right.
But if you don't neutralize the isotope, the radiation will eventually eat through the lead. You have to address the core exile. The destruction of the monster shouldn't be physical obliteration. It should be the destruction of its burden.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. You are treating the monster as if it is capable of rational self-reflection, even in the middle of a disaster. We're talking about an entity that is completely, fundamentally blended.
Can you expand on what you mean by blended in this specific context?
Absolutely. So in IFS, blending happens when a part completely takes over yourself. Capital S, self. The self is your calm, centered core. When a part blends with you, you lose all perspective.
Right.
Think of severe road rage. In that moment, you aren't a person experiencing anger. You are the anger. All logic goes entirely out the window. Now multiply that by 1,000 years. The mummy doesn't just have a legacy burden of revenge. It is the revenge. Look at the physical state of the mummy as established in the material.
You mean the constant cycle of visceral regeneration and rotting?
Yes, that rotting and reforming isn't just a cool visual effect Cronin threw in. It is a physical manifestation of a biological and psychological system trying to repair itself, but going in the completely wrong direction. It is a runaway train of a traumatic response. When an entity is that completely blended with a millennium of rage, intellectual curiosity cannot pierce the storm. You cannot sit down and exercise empathetic witnessing when the system is actively physically trying to annihilate you. The physical threat must be neutralized first before any unburdening can even be conceptualized.
I hear you, but I think you're mischaracterizing what witnessing actually looks like in a heightened cinematic narrative context. Like I mentioned, it isn't pulling up a chair in the middle of a collapsing tomb.
Well, it certainly sounds like it sometimes.
No, it's about the protagonist's fundamental stance toward the threat. And this becomes incredibly clear, actually, when we look at the specific way the mummy's body decays and regenerates. It isn't random rot. Cronin ties it directly to bloodlines. If we pivot from just the physical rotting of the monster to its familial connection, the IFS framework provides the exact solution you claim is impossible.
Ah, you're referring to the possession elements in the film.
Exactly. In these narratives, we often see a form of possession, where the mummy's curse infects the descendants. Traditionally, we view possession as an external demon invading a host. But under IFS, possession is just extreme blending.
Interesting.
It is an ancestor's protector part literally reaching through the bloodline and taking over a descendant to fulfill an ancient unmet need.
Which is a terrifying concept. It's generational trauma made incredibly literal.
It is. The protagonists are forced to confront the unhealed, dark parts of their own lineage. To win this confrontation, they don't need a bigger gun or a stronger magic spell or, a bigger explosion. They need to achieve unblending.
Walk me through how you see unblending working when someone is actively possessed by an ancient mummy's curse, because that sounds like a tall order.
Unblending is the process of creating space between the burden and the being. The protagonist has to recognize that their family member or their ancestor is simply being controlled by a wounded part. The victory comes from acknowledging the pain without being consumed by it.
Right.
It's the protagonist standing their ground and effectively saying, I see that you are not the trauma, you are just carrying it. That realization, that empathetic separation is what breaks the curse. It diffuses the energy of the blended part.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered the immediacy of the threat? Unblending is a process that requires a modicum of safety. It requires the prefrontal cortex, the logical, compassionate, observing part of the brain, to be online.
And you're arguing the film doesn't allow for that.
I'm arguing that body horror, by its very physiological design, takes the prefrontal cortex completely offline. It bypasses reason and directly attacks the brainstem. You are arguing that a protagonist should calmly recognize their family member is just acting out of a wounded part.
Yes.
But when that family member's jaw is unhinging, when their physical form is actively mutating in front of you, the survival instinct overrides everything. You cannot philosophize with an ancestor's trauma when it is tearing the flesh from your bones.
But isn't the role of a hero to push past that base biological imperative?
There is a difference between bravery and biological impossibility. The biological imperative to survive cannot simply be suspended for the sake of ancestral empathy. The boundary violation of body horror is too severe.
I think that's a bit reductive.
When a threat is that immediate and physically transformative, the system categorizes it as a lethal contagion. Empathy in that exact moment
isn't a higher moral stance.
To the brainstem, it's suicide.
Let's follow that logic to its conclusion, though. If the protagonist relies solely on that brainstem biological imperative, if they just blow up the monster to reestablish the physical boundary, what are we actually telling the audience? We are reinforcing the idea that violent suppression is the only way to handle deep trauma. I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it completely ignores the audience's own internal system. Let's look at the audience's exiles for a moment.
You mean the repressed fears the viewers carry with them into the theater?
Right, exactly. When people watch a film like this, their own deeply buried exiles' fears of betrayal, fears of isolation, fears of our bodies betraying us through illness or death, are resonating with the mummy on screen. The mummy acts as a massive cinematic mirror for the parts of ourselves we have banished to the dark.
Okay, sure.
If the narrative allows the mummy to be violently destroyed, the audience's exiles are told, yes, you are right to hide. If you come out, you will be annihilated.
But they aren't the monster.
Subconsciously, they identify with the monster's pain. But if the narrative allows the mummy to be seen, to be validated, and then to voluntarily fade away, well, not literally fade away, but perhaps by releasing its hatred into the elements, into fire, water, or air, as the IFS unburdening process suggests in clinical settings.
Right.
It provides a profound emotional unburdening for the viewer. It models a healthy release. It allows the audience to remain in a state of self-observant, compassionate, and enriched. We heal the audience by healing the monster.
You are severely underestimating the mechanics of the audience's firefighters, though. Let's look at what actually happens in the theater during a Cronin film. It's not a quiet therapy session. When the jump scares hit, when the body horror reaches its absolute zenith, the audience's firefighters react instantly to manage the intense spike in anxiety.
Which looks like what, practically speaking?
It looks like screaming. It looks like nervous laughter. It looks like covering their eyes, clenching the armrest, or, cracking a joke to the person next to them. These are immediate, high-energy pressure release valves designed by the psyche to prevent total psychological blending with the terror on screen. Adrenaline is flooding their system. Cortisol levels are spiking.
I agree that the physiological response is intense, but why does that preclude a therapeutic narrative resolution?
Because adrenaline has a half-life. If you build that intense physiological tension for 90 minutes, constantly triggering the audience's firefighter parts with visceral threats, you cannot simply resolve it with a quiet, peaceful conversation where the monster just fades into the wind.
Well,
If you do that, you are stranding the audience in a state of high physiological arousal. The adrenaline has nowhere to go. They need the massive explosion, the definitive physical destruction of the monster to serve as an undeniable external signal to their internal managers that the threat is definitively over.
like a visual all-clear siren.
Exactly. Without that violent physical climax, the internal system cannot safely power down. The nervous laughter doesn't resolve. It just turns into lingering anxiety. The explosive climax isn't about teaching a moral lesson on violence. It's a necessary physiological mechanism to close the loop on the stress cycle you've artificially induced.
But doesn't that just perpetuate the cycle of repression? If the managers reassert control through a violent explosion, the exiles go right back into the vault. We leave the theater exactly as we entered it, repressed, carrying the same burdens, just, temporarily exhausted by the adrenaline dump.
We leave the theater safe. That is the primary function of the managers. We cannot lose sight of the fact that the audience agreed to the safety contract of the movie theater precisely so their internal system wouldn't be permanently altered or traumatized by the experience.
Right?
The explosive climax is the fulfillment of that contract. It says, the boundary between reality and nightmare has been forcibly restored. The monster is dead. You can go home.
I believe horror as a genre is capable of more than just restoring the status quo, especially when the source material is as rich as this. By applying the internal family systems lens to Cronin's The Mummy, we uncover a much deeper, much more challenging narrative truth. What is buried never truly dies. It merely ferments.
That is undeniably true of the setup of the film.
And it has to be true of the resolution. If we continue to treat our traumas, both personal and generational, as monsters to be locked away under stone slabs or violently destroyed with explosives, we guarantee their return in increasingly uncontrollable, mutated forms. That's the entire premise of the mummy's curse.
Right.
Meeting our deepest, most monstrous traumas with curiosity and witnessing, rather than suppression, represents a more sophisticated paradigm for storytelling. It demands more of the protagonist, who has to look past the rotting flesh to see the wounded exile underneath, and it demands more of the audience, who has to sit with their discomfort, rather than demanding a cheap adrenaline release. But ultimately, it offers a truer, more lasting catharsis. You cannot kill a part of yourself. You can only heal it.
And I maintain that while the IFS lens perfectly and beautifully explains the origin of the horror, the legacy burdens, the exile trauma, the protective rage of the firefighters, it cannot dictate the resolution in a visceral visual medium. Film, and specifically body horror, operates on the violation of the physical form.
I see that.
When the body is the literal home of our psychological parts, and that home is invaded, warped, and destroyed on screen, the audience's system requires a concrete, boundary-restoring physical climax. The intellectual understanding of the monster's pain, no matter how profound, does not negate the immediate biological necessity
to survive its wrath. The audience needs that explosive release to allow their own internal firefighters to stand down and for their managers to safely close the file on the experience.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently as we wrap up today's discussion. Perhaps the true measure of the film's success and the strength of the source material's deliberate ambiguity is the lingering question it leaves us with after the credits roll. When the lights finally come up in the theater, does the audience feel a profound sense of relief, a true psychological unburdening, or do they simply feel absolute nervous exhaustion from surviving the ride?
It entirely depends on which parts of them were forced to work the hardest in the dark.
Exactly. Both of our perspectives reveal that Cronin's work forces a complex psychological war within the viewer. The heavy lead box we build to contain our fears is always waiting to be tested, and perhaps that is the ultimate function of horror. The next time the lights go down in a theater, take a moment to observe your own managers, exiles, and firefighters. See who is really reacting to the shadows on the screen.